Yes. So good afternoon. My name is Shelby Walker. I'm the director of Oregon Sea Grant. In this presentation, I am wearing my other hat, which is chair of the Science and Technical Advisory Committee. This committee provides scientific guidance to OPAC and Oregon agencies, but the bulk of our work recently has been focused on the Marine Reserve's assessment process. I do have slides. These are basically a visual representation of what was in the packet of material that you have. It is 4A, which I know everyone's read in detail. But this is going to just highlight effectively where we are in the Marine Reserve's process. Kristen, thank you very much for the introduction to this. I just want to thank Kristen and her team for all of their exceptionally hard work on this, and particularly recently. I also want to call out Dr. Ann Hayden-Lesmeister, who has done a stellar job in helping to support the process moving forward. We're incredibly fortunate to have her. I shudder to think of what would happen if it was just me. So, Kristen provided a nice update on the legislative mandates. Specifically, this is referencing the assessment process and what will be delivered to the state legislature in 2023. There are just a few things in here that I wanted to highlight. When the draft report is due, when the final report is due, which Kristen pointed out and which I'll get to in a moment. It will be done by a public university within Oregon as chosen by STAC. So we are not doing the assessment, we are managing that process. One thing I wanted to point out here, which is the bulk of the conversation, is will be research and prepared within existing resources and without additional appropriation. So we'll get to that in a moment. At our last meeting, we had a discussion about the Marine Reserve assessment process, and subsequently OPAC sent a letter to STAC basically asking for additional information, providing scenarios of what would transpire with or without funding for the public university assessment, develop a timeline for how the public process would need to occur for STAC to meet its 2023 deadline, and work with ODF&W to clarify how the agency is moving forward with respect to monitoring, preparing the assessment, and what the implications might be if there is a gap in monitoring. This is the process timeline. Again, this is what is provided in your handout. This is the overview. I will briefly step through what each of these years look like. Here we are in 2019. ODF&W anticipates providing the synthesis report outline this summer. And we also anticipate having a draft request for proposals for the chosen university at the end of the year. Moving forward, we will need to start thinking pretty specifically about how we will support this effort. In 2020, ODF&W will be continuing all of its great work with the Marine Reserves with respect to monitoring on both the ecological and the human dimension side. And when we get to 2021, that's when the work is really going to need to start with respect to the RFP solicitation process. So the draft, I anticipate, will be done. As I mentioned, towards the end of this year, we'll start advertising the beginning of 2021 and have that selection process be completed towards middle-late summer. At the end of 2021, we anticipate receiving ODF&W's Marine Reserve synthesis report. We've scheduled periodic check-ins with the chosen university, first in January, then in April. We'll have a draft report to STAC in June. Comments returned back to the chosen university. Then the final report going in September. We deliver the draft report in October of 2022. Again, that goes to the interim subcommittee. And then with the final report going in March. As Kristen noted, this is not a lot of time moving forward. But this is the process timeline that we anticipate moving forward with, as described here and in your handout. So, moving forward to the other components of the OPAC request. And I'm dividing this into two separate buckets. One is the RFP/assessment process. The other part is the ODF&W process. This focuses specifically on the RFP scenarios. We basically have two situations. One is we continue as we are with no additional appropriations to support the assessment process. Specifically, this is the chosen university doing an assessment of the synthesis report of the marine reserves provided by ODF&W. Scenario 2 is funding is provided to conduct the assessment of the synthesis report. In terms of possible outcomes, scenario 1, where we continue on as we are with the status quo, possible outcomes, and if you read the document, you'll note these are highly likely outcomes. We will get no responses to the RFP, as in there will be no university that actually responds. Another possible outcome is there's a team that comes forward that wherein response can be biased or of insufficient quality. So if you polled any of the staff members, the general feeling is no one is going to respond to this. So we will effectively not be able to comply with the legislation. Scenario 2, there is sufficient funding. By sufficient, a rough estimate based on discussions with staff members as well as examining other similar level reviews by other groups such as the Institute of Natural Resources, between $150,000 and $200,000 projected. We will actually have people who respond to the RFP who are qualified and for which we can manage conflict of interest to conduct the assessment. As such, we'll be able to generate a high-quality, unbiased report that can then help inform the process moving forward. I think it's no surprise that the staff recommendation here is scenario 2. I would just like to impress upon everyone this particular point. It is unlikely in the extreme that anyone will respond to this RFP in the absence of funding.
Can you clarify if that price includes university overhead?
It does.
And is that at the legislative level, which is like not the 50% or whatever's normal?
I looked at F&A race. There is no legislative level. There's an agency level, which is 35%. If you would like additional information about this, we've incorporated which page you can go to in our 15-page scenarios document. ODF&W scenarios. I will touch upon this, but the reason that I'm making Kristen stay up here is she will be able to provide additional information about these particular scenarios moving forward. It's been really great being able to work with ODF&W on this so we can get a better understanding of where they're coming from and what is needed moving forward. Scenario 1, and Kristen, please, of course, stop me if I get anything wrong. There is no additional appropriation apart from what Kristen noted in her earlier presentation. But there are a few things that we will note as missing. One is there are 3 ROV surveys that no longer have funding, and so there will be a loss of data from those 3 ROV surveys. There will also be a loss of data from 2 hook and line surveys, and a possible loss of oceanographic data. So this is part of their monitoring effort. I would say that, of course, it is not all of their monitoring effort. And ODF&W is doing a great job with what they have moving forward. Just a little bit of an elaboration, the loss of data from the 3 ROV surveys, those will provide information that could help inform the synthesis report. The loss of data from the 2 hook and line surveys, basically ODF&W is having to redirect some resources to the development of the synthesis report. But that data, while not informing the synthesis report, does help inform the long-term time series. And as was noted earlier, given the amount of time that is needed to determine ecological change, a loss of a time series point, particularly with the staggered nature of monitoring, is pretty important. Scenario 2, augmented funding. The ROV surveys are provided. That, as I mentioned, could then feed also into the synthesis report. The other 2 situations remain the same. Scenario 3, with total coverage of all 3 of those components, that would be the ROV funding, no gap in the hook and line series, and no loss of any of the oceanographic data streams. And because this was being discussed with the Science and Technical Advisory Committee, of course we take very seriously the need for time series, the importance of having this information, and the desire to make sure that the synthesis report is as robust as we can make it. Of course, stack recommendation here is scenario 3.
I did want to clarify for the 3 ROV surveys, 2 of those surveys would impact the synthesis report. The 3rd one would happen after 2021. Things rapidly change in the ODFW world, and as we're narrowing and coming to the end of the biennium, we are actually have some vacancy savings that we've been able to find right now in the last week. And we're trying to see if we can get one of those 3 ROV surveys done in the next couple months. So stay tuned. We're seeing if we can get a contract and a vessel and a weather window. But because we had a staff vacancy, been able to.
Okay, so the dollar figures may change slightly, but generally
Yes.
speaking, these are the scenarios that we're dealing with. And with that, with the lightning speed that we move through the different scenarios in response to the OPAC letter, I want to make sure that we did open this up for discussion. One other thing that I wanted to highlight is, per the chair's request, I did want to make sure that we had a letter incorporated for consideration. That's part of your package. So if you take a look at that, have not already, that basically just articulates the 2 scenarios that STAC has recommended, and OPAC can consider whether or not it wants to put that forward for the governor's consideration, and any changes that may be that you may wish to make, and when would be a good time to submit that.
Yeah. So thank you. That was excellent report. And one of the things that I just want to compliment is that we submitted this letter in January, maybe, gave them a timeline, gave STAC a timeline of replying by fall, and they beat that, obviously, because we're talking about in spring, which is great, and they did a wonderful job of laying out and answering all of our questions, including the timeline, cost estimates, and different types of scenarios. so I appreciate that. I also wanna just be clear that, you know, in 2023, there will be some sort of evaluation process, even if no funding comes through. As Shelby pointed out, it won't be ideal. It won't fulfill the original vision in the legislation of having a university evaluation, but, you know, something will happen. But I think our goal between now and your timeline is to try and help find some resources or encourage others to find resources to try and fill that gap and get that important piece in place. So with that, I'm definitely willing to open it up for questions and excited about potential answers. I think one question that I have heard come up in previous discussions on this topic is it's kind of unclear, or it seems to be unclear whose responsibility it is to try and raise these monies. You know, it's not STAC's responsibility per se to turn into a fundraising entity and get its own money. It's not necessarily OPAC's either, although we can definitely provide some support and nudges. Some people have expressed interest in different places those funds could go, like the Ocean Science Trust, or maybe that there might be some private funding match that could evolve. If the state were to put in some money, they could make kind of a challenge grant, encourage private funders to put in money. But it's unclear, I feel like, who's, you know, kind of ultimately responsible for that. So I didn't know if we wanted to pontificate on that for a minute, if you all want to take the discussion.
Just a quick comment, because Anne is super dedicated and truly a fantastic resource. She actually went back to the legislative hearings that was talking about this. And there was, as folks who were involved in the process early on, a fair bit of sensitivity to outside resources coming in. So I would say that as we consider options for supporting this moving forward, just keeping that in mind.
Absolutely. I do think that's one of the ideas that the Science Trust came up, because they would provide a third-party, peer-reviewed, independent kind of lens, if you would, on wherever those funds may come from. So, I mean, in my perspective, I don't know if this is accurate, but my perspective, I feel like there is some responsibility on the agency's part to, from ODFW, to help come up with some of the funding, or at least try to advance it through the agency budget process in proposals. And so I don't know if there's been any internal discussions about how to help potentially fill these gaps.
So that comment raises a bunch of thoughts in my mind, and I do want to point out that one of the problems that we have with the ROV surveys is that there's been a change in federal funds coming into the agency that previously supported those ROV surveys, and so that change in federal appropriations has left us with a gap in funding that's unrelated to the state support and the state funding of the Marine Reserves program. And so some of what we're trying to do, and this has just happened recently, and so we're trying to figure out how to address that gap. The other comment that comes to mind is that we are very sensitive to what Shelby raised, which is that there were very explicit intentions about monies that flow into the Marine Reserves program when the Marine Reserves program was developed. And we are very respectful of those original intentions. And so we do not have the flexibility to backfill, if you will, funding gaps in the Marine Reserves program in the way that we would kind of flexibly manage our budget and our management needs in other parts of our program. So, yes, the agency can help address these issues, and we're certainly doing that on the federal funding side to try and figure out solutions for the ROV surveys. But we have some obligations that stem from that original discussion that we're respectful of and sensitive to.
What about the
So-
opportunity for a pop? I'm not just to be clear, I wasn't implying that I wanted to take away from existing funding in order to do the university study, but instead, how do you supplement or increase the level of funding for this one-time request?
I would be interested in comments from this group, because one of the things that we're held to is the legislation and the fact that there will be no more appropriations from the state. And so that was part of the presentation, that's part of the backdrop of our funding situation. So, we need to be consistent with that mandate that's been delivered.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things that I'm hearing though, and maybe I'm missing some nuance, is if the agency isn't going to request money because it can't, and it needs to be held to legislation, and that there's no more funding coming from the legislature to support the program, and yet you need state funding in order to fill the gap, and we're nervous about taking private funding, you know, you're kind of getting this circle where there's no way out. And so it's almost like we need to move into solution modes as opposed to cycling and the limitations. I'll leave that comment out there.
I think the other thing that I would add to this is repeating the comment that the OOST is, the Oregon Ocean Science Trust, was developed by the task force. The concept was developed specifically with the purpose of being a vessel where funds from various sources could be deposited and the state could apply it to the state's priorities. And the way that the OOST was developed through legislation made it somewhat awkward vehicle for doing that, for implementing that function, and the legislation that's in play right now would fix some of the awkwardness that is there, and that's really positive. I think that there's a lot of traction for fixing some of those issues, and that could be a really important part of the solution.
Helpful. Charlie, then Ryan?
And Brent, you probably don't have the answer to this, but what is the role of the governor's office in recommended budget items? If we back up to the reason why we dealt with marine reserves, it has to do with an executive order that came out of the governor's office. And so my question would be, we are in this evaluation of the program mode. It seems sensible that the governor's office would be playing a role in recommendations around that evaluation, given that this started there. Maybe it was with a different governor. However, this body serves at the leisure of that body, and so I'm kind of curious where is the governor's office role potentially in recommended budget items?
I think I'll reserve the right to comment on that until I can speak with Jason about this, until he gets this, and then me and him can really talk about it. Just because the budget process is a bit above my pay grade. And what forecasting a next budget cycle out looks like is pretty far out, so I can't really answer that. And it wasn't a satisfying answer.
I didn't expect that. Yeah, got it. It was a discussion point maybe as much as it was
Right. Ryan?
Somewhat similar to Charlie's comment, I guess, your question about the role of the governor's office in this, and as some of the newbie in the room, I get to ask kind of the simpler done questions, at least for a little while.
Can you talk a little louder?
Sure. So I guess my question is really more about the question about the role of the Coastal Caucus at this point in time, and how much information has been conveyed to them and other legislators who are involved in the originating legislation, and making sure that their awareness level about this funding need to fulfill the original intent and objectives of the legislation, and whether that has been communicated to those legislators, and making sure that they're aware of this request, and whether there's a role for this group to play in communicating that information. So that's 2 cents.
So I will tell you that STAC as a body has not connected with the Coastal Caucus on this. I would say it would be particularly impactful if OPAC decided to forward a letter to the governor and have that coincident with conversations with the Coastal Caucus.
Can you repeat that answer? I really do want to hear it. Sorry.
Basically, if OPAC decided to forward a letter to the governor regarding these recommendations, it would be nice if having that would be coincident with any conversations with the Coastal Caucus moving forward. And one thing to consider is clearly there is a whole lot going on with the state legislature right now, with the governor's office, and the bandwidth I expect is highly limited for this consideration. So perhaps we can consider advancing this sometime at the fall meeting in anticipation of the short session where there may be some additional, at least, opportunity for consideration without a lot of the churn that's going on right now.
And I think if we wanted to have some sort of response or discussion or follow-up dialogue with the governor's office coming out of this, that would be something we could add as kind of, if we were to do a legislative, or if someone was to do a legislative strategy, maybe the governor's office, what does it look like? Like, is there any potential left in this session? I assume the answer is no, but, others might have more expertise in that than I do. And if not, then could you do the short session or get into the, the budget process, or kind of what are all the different pathways forward? Just explore what's an option and what's not. Patty, and then Laura?
I just wanted to say in response to what Gina said about a possible POP, assuming for a moment that the agency would be comfortable with that, which at this point not because of the legislation, but at this point, at least, that would not really fit with the time frame, because if I'm looking at the time frame correctly, the funding needs to be identified by this time next year, and there's all the POPs for this year have either been accepted or not, so that's not a possibility. So the next POP round would go into the budget for 21-23, which would be the budget that would start July 1st, 2021, which is past when we've said we need to have the funding identified. So there may be the short session, maybe some other options, but it's not going to be through the regular POP process if it's going to meet the timeframe that I think.
Lauren?
I just wanted to point out a couple things on the financial end of things, that the Marine Reserves program is financed from the general fund and not by Department of Fish and Wildlife. And the reason for that being was that in the early days of this, that was hammered out due to the fact that the fishermen that were buying licenses and the commercial fishermen that were paying the landing fees and so on, where they were making the sacrifice and giving up fishing grounds, didn't feel that they should shoulder that burden. And I just wanted this body to know that. And as far as taking money from outside sources, it was very explicit in the intent too that our oceans aren't for sale. So just wanted to make those 2 points.
Thank you. Are there any other comments? Anything on the phone, Andy? I want to make sure you get a chance. Well, I think that in terms of advancing the dialogue, this was really helpful, Sheldon. Like I said, I appreciate that you jumped on it so quickly and that staff was able to respond so efficiently and kind of get this in the forefront of our thinking. Shelby did draft a letter and submit it in advance for folks to look at. One of the things we were talking about is maybe using this, maybe not transmitting it, but using it as a start of a dialogue to go to the governor's office and say, okay, this is a good scenario of the problem or the challenge that's ahead of us. How do we start to think of a way forward? And what does that entail? So is there any thoughts about that? Are you comfortable with it?
I'm comfortable with this, and I like the idea of starting a dialogue based on solutions, not barriers. And that's kind of where I would like to see this go with the governor's office. I do wanna have a really good understanding based on what Patty raised about timeline and whether or not there is a sort of time period where we've timed out essentially and we're stuck with status quo. And so it would be really good to know, so just my understanding of working in the processes, nothing takes as long as you think it's gonna take. It takes a year longer, and that all depends on who's involved. So it would be really good to know is like what is that time frame, and if there's some way we could include that into the letter as far as like so we have a realization of what we're working up against would be helpful. Is that understanding? Do we have that understanding?
Well, Shelby laid out a pretty good timeline in terms of that.
So I would say that the absolute drop dead date for the RFP process will need to be before we issue the RFP.
Date.
So that would be as outlined January of 2021.
That's helpful, thank you.
Ideally, we would have
Right.
information ahead of time because people will need to be thinking about this
Yeah.
moving forward. But because the RFP is what people will be responding to, that any kind of funding information needs to be articulated in that document. ODF&W, would you like to comment on funding timelines?
Yeah, so it depends on which, we're actually talking about 3 different biennia, so it's a little bit more complicated. So one is, maybe this ROV survey getting done now, but like 2019 is split between bienniums. We had planned 2 ROV surveys next biennium, but POPs and legislative requests already past that. So, but there is the ROV survey that would be in the biennium after that. But
Yeah, I certainly understand the deadline changes based on the pathway or mechanism that you go, whether you're going
Yeah,
through
or
a
which
budget
process
process
you're
or what.
talking about.
I think it's kind of getting at when is it that we gotta have this thing into an RFP or we don't do an RFP or you do 3 RFPs.
Okay. Well, I think that, Lauren has his card up. I'll wrap this up after Lauren.
I just wanted to say that I'm very much in support of the sending a letter as written. It's very timely and it tosses it up on the radar.
One of the comments that we got in the letter is one of there need to be a lot of edits to the letter potentially, and so the challenge of group editing it is gonna be a little bit hard. It would be nice to add some background to it, and some of the timeline information's missing, in this draft, which we could, potentially add to it as well. So I think there needs to be some edits to it. But I do, like I said, appreciate, I think this is an opportunity. Thankfully, the deadline's not July of this year, so we have a year and a half to try and work on some solutions and a path forward, and I hope everyone will try and help think about what those are. I do think as a follow-up action that we can commit to, I should ask, can I commit the executive team to meet with the governor's office or Bryn and just see if we can have a discussion, and then if anyone else wants to join, you're welcome to, and we can report back at our next meeting.
I can work with you to set that up. I can work with you guys to set that up with me and Jason and the exec team.
Okay, great. Are there any other follow-ups or next steps that we could take that would be helpful, Shelby or others?
And just to let you know, we're continuing to work, we being STAC, to work to refine the criteria, refine the process moving forward. So I anticipate that we'll have a summer remote meeting and likely a fall in-person meeting.
So with that, thank you very much for your time. Please thank STAC for us, for getting this done and transmitting it, I appreciate it. Charlie, do you wanna take 3 minutes to talk to
I think it was distributed at the last minute, kind of as a digital update, as a reminder. Oh, my apologies. As a reminder, a few years ago, we set marine debris as a priority for OPAC, and I worked with NOAA and a number of you and other stakeholders and Oregon agencies to develop an Oregon Marine Debris Action Plan. We recently reconvened that group. It's been 2 years since that action plan was put in place. We had a great meeting in Newport for 2 days at HMSC. Sea Grant was a sponsor of that and kind of helped do a lot of the arrangements and working with NOAA to get our agenda together and support some facilitation. We basically updated that plan to some degree. You will get a presentation, hopefully, or at least a document of what that looks like, the 2-year update. And I just wanted to put it on your radar so you know that that plan is operational. If you want to look and see what actions have been accomplished and what actions haven't been accomplished, they're all documented in that document. I appreciate seeing documents doing the work that they said they were going to do, and I'm committed to making sure that you guys stay updated on that. And so my point here is simply just to say we can actually do stuff with this group, and they result in pretty big changes in Oregon. I think if you look at that actions document, you'll see there's a lot of federal funding that came into the state for derelict debris and derelict vessel removal, initiated a number of different programs within the State Marine Board, with the Governor's Office, and otherwise. It's been pretty successful, and it's being updated as we speak, and we will get the 2.0 at our next meeting.
Thank you, Charlie. So now we're gonna move into the last agenda item, which is basically a recap and talking about scheduling. So first I wanna thank you all for a really productive meeting. I think sometimes we get together and we do updates all day, and this one we did stuff. And so, we approved part 5, which I think everyone deserves a celebratory pat on the back, or maybe something stronger. A cocktail afterwards no, not a punch, a cocktail for that. We advanced the text on part 3 and launched hopefully phase 2 of the process. And I do wanna recognize Charlie and Andy and Deanna's really hard work on that over the last 2 years. We approved a letter to the governor for supporting CZMA and Sea Grant program funding. We learned about Cap and Invest and what that might mean for the coast. We heard about other legislative bills, the history and potential for sea otters, NOAA's aquaculture program. We got a Marine Reserves 101. And then lastly, we just heard about stacks analysis to the questions that we had, and now have a follow-up meeting at some point with the Natural Resource Policy staff. So, all great stuff. I do want to remind you, as Patty mentioned earlier, that there is this public meeting on May 22nd and the LCBC Commission meeting on May 24th to talk about part 5 and part 3. If you're interested in attending those, that'd be great. Our next meeting, we'll send a doodle poll out, will be in the fall, somewhere on the coast, I don't know where, happy to take suggestions and nominations. At that meeting, we'll continue our investigation on aquaculture, hear about ODFW's near shore seafloor mapping. We'll get an update on part 3, I assume. Great. We'll ask for a presentation on the Marine Debris Action Plan and maybe other topics that are of interest that came up today, for example, whale entanglement or something like that. So, are there other topics that we want to make sure we cover on our fall agenda? Patty?
We would suggest that there be an update on marine offshore wind energy. As you all may know, there's been quite a bit of interest off of California, and Bologna has proposed interest areas that there's been quite a bit, all 3 of them there's been interest in. And as we understand from talking to Bologna, the southern 100 miles off the Oregon coast has the same great wind resource that the northern part of California does. So we anticipate there is going to be interest in offshore wind, and this is, outside the territorial sea, not in the territorial sea, about 12 miles off, 10 to 12 miles offshore perhaps. So we definitely want OPAC to weigh into how the state should be approaching that in terms of how we would be working with BOEM and maybe interest. So we definitely want to have that, and maybe even have BOEM come up and give a presentation in terms of what's going on in California and what they will be looking at potentially in the future for Oregon.
Great. Thank you, Patty. Walter?
Yeah, thanks. And this has to do with what Steve brought up just a little when he was talking with David. We have elected officials on OPAC and we have state agency people, but we also have members of the public. And as in our roles here, we are public officials, and Steve brought up conflict of interest. And I would just like to, just put out there that there is an online class given by the Ethics Commission for people to take. I know state employees take it, but it's a good refresher. It reminds us of what our duties are as public officials and what we need to navigate in our roles as public officials. I'm just putting it out there. I don't know how we would do that, but it's an online course. It doesn't take that long, and it would just be a good heads up and informational piece for everybody.
Great, thank you. Anything else for